Okay, so we are today and tomorrow doing part one and part two, just so you're not sitting here for a long time. We are going to look at the Civil War today. We're going to look at like the early part of the war and some challenges of both sides, the strengths and weaknesses, and some specific battles. There, it'll be a little more in depth than what the packet had, but it will definitely give you just a little more insight if you're interested in that. So we're gonna again look at the Civil War today. Hopefully everything is gonna work for me. So we're gonna look at the early years of the war, the first battles, other issues from the first years, kind of where each side stood at the beginning, their plans, their strategies, their leaders. So where we left off, remember we were talking about Fort Sumter, and with Fort Sumter, many consider that to be the beginning of the Civil War, the first battle. It's a couple days. Remember, Lincoln vows that he's going to hold on to all of the Union forts and military bases and things like that in the South. The South said, nope, this is on our land. These are our forts. You're not going to get these. And so you have a battle ensue. No one dies at Fort Sumter, but Lincoln does have to surrender that fort. And with that, the Lincoln calls for more troops, so you have more states secede. So you have a total of 11 states in what they now consider themselves the Confederate States of America. Remember in civics when we talked about a confederal type of government, that's where the states have all the power and the central government essentially has none. Remember, we had that with the Articles of Confederation. It didn't really work well with the federal government having no power, and so we moved to federalism, where we have shared power between our federal government and our states, and it has seemed to work a lot better for us. So your southern states seceded, remember, justifying it through the 10th Amendment, through states' rights, saying, that they should be able to make their own decisions. And really what it came down to was they didn't want the federal government making the decision over slavery for them. So while the Civil War was definitely about slavery, they were using states' rights as that kind of justification for that. Definitely about slavery, obviously about slavery and everything that they wanted. So again, South Carolina is the first state to secede on December 20th, 1860. Justified through states' rights, Fort Sumter surrendered on April 14th, 1861. I think Lincoln called for about 1 million more troops or something like that. Maybe it wasn't that many, but thousands, hundreds of thousands of more troops. And when he does that, 4 more states secede. So this is largely considered the start of the Civil War. From April 14th until the summer of 1861, you don't have a battle. You just have both sides really preparing, getting themselves ready for the war, and gathering supplies, things like that. So you have 11 states in the Confederacy, and obviously choosing sides was very easy for most of your states in the North and a lot of your states most of your states in the South. But you do have 4 states that really are having a hard time with choosing a side. Do they choose the Union? Do they stick with the country that they're a part of, or do they choose the Confederacy? Which side do you choose? Which side do you feel is more right in the situation? And so these 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, they had ties to both the North and the South through industry, through slavery, through all of those things. If you look on this map, you have Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia technically wasn't a state yet. West Virginia did not become a state until 1863. This part, it used to be a part of Virginia, hence the name West Virginia. But this state, they chose to become their own state because they didn't agree with secession. But West Virginia is not a state yet. It's still part of Virginia, but that kind of like group of people decided they wanted to be their own state. So now these 4 border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, they all have to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to choose to stay with the Union, or are they going to choose to secede and go with the Confederate States of America? So they really have, each one of these states has really important assets for both the North and the South. So Missouri itself, if you controlled Missouri, you could control parts of the Mississippi and routes west. If we go back to our map here, here's Missouri right here, and the Mississippi River, you know, it's here, and they just have, you would have a lot of control of that area. Kentucky, you would control the Ohio River. Rivers are so important because you are moving people, you're moving supplies, you're moving all of those things, and having control of these big rivers like the Mississippi, parts of the Mississippi and the Ohio River, you could really control who and what the other side might be able to move during the war. Delaware, it was very close to Philadelphia, which was a key city for the Union, a key river city, key industry city. And so controlling Delaware would be really important for the Union if they could get these border states to stay. And then Maryland, out of all of these, is probably the most important border state to keep. Lincoln really wanted to keep Maryland. It was very close to Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy. And obviously some land was taken from Maryland to create DC. And so it's so close to the capital of the Union as well. It's probably about 2 hours. Richmond and DC are like 2 hours apart. And so it was very super important to keep Maryland if Lincoln could, because it would hopefully prevent the Confederacy from coming in and invading in Union territory. So what is Lincoln to do? What does he do? So he tries his best to keep these border states within the country. So this is just kind of showing you all the states at close to that before secession. So Lincoln is successful in keeping these border states in the Union. That does not mean, though, that all of the people who lived in these states supported the Union or supported the Confederacy. Lincoln, throughout the war, not only did he have to make a strategy to beat the Confederacy, but he also had to have a strategy to make sure he kept those border states in the Union during the war. Because who's to say that one little thing that he does or one decision made doesn't, make one of the border states leave. So he is able to keep all 4 of those border states in the Union during the entire war, but it is a struggle that he politically has to go through and has to make sure that he's keeping a lot of people happy. I do not envy Abraham Lincoln during this time period for having to do those things during the war. Okay, so he's able to keep those border states. So now we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of each side. The North, also known as the Union, this is easy to remember, the United States of America. The South, also known as the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, right? They both had their own advantages and disadvantages during the war. An advantage of the North is they had a much larger population that could fight. Now, the South technically had more people because they had millions of slaves. But obviously in the South, they weren't going to let their slaves fight. Why would they let slaves fight in a war that's over slavery? What side are they obviously going to pick? The North had more resources and more money than the South did. The North's industry was definitely an advantage for them during the war. Because they had those factories and they had all of those things, when they needed a resource of something, more guns or something like that, they could easily and quickly create that resource. They also had more railroads, which we know this from chapter 14, more railroads. They used canals, and their factories definitely came into play. Now, some disadvantages for the North. Most of the Civil War was fought in the South. Almost all of it was fought in the South, and the people who lived in the North that were fighting for the Union had less knowledge of that land. So they didn't necessarily know the geography there, things like that. And so they having less knowledge of the land was a disadvantage for them. Advantages for the South, they had top-notch military leaders. They had Robert E. Lee, they had Stonewall Jackson, they had a lot of different leaders that were very beneficial to them in key situations that would lead the South to many victories during the Civil War. They had that good fighting spirit. When you think of that, I want you to think back to when we talked about the American Revolution. The South considered this like their American Revolution. They were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for independence. So that fighting spirit, that determination that the colonists had during the Revolution, that's kind of the same as what your Southerners had during this time period. Now, spoiler alert, they lose, but they really felt like that their fighting spirit, their determination would deter the Union from fighting and give up. They did have home field advantage. They knew the land, they knew the ins and outs, they knew roads, they knew back roads, they knew the areas in which they were fighting. And so having that home field advantage would be an opportunity for the South to take control of the war at different points during the war. Disadvantages, they had less money and resources in the North. This would prove, obviously, if you're looking at it, if you have less resources than your opponent, then more than likely the odds of you winning are slim. And this is what would happen to the South. They didn't have as many railroads. They didn't have as many factories. And so getting resources proved a lot more difficult for them. And so they wanted to, and so they couldn't do the things that they wanted to do. So the South, that was a huge disadvantage for them that would prove detrimental to their cause. So those are their strengths and weaknesses. Each side also, looking at the numbers, you had of soldiers that fought for each side. This is throughout the 4 years of the war. So this is the entire war. For the South, you have about 900,000 soldiers fight. That's soldiers of all ages. This is not African Americans because the South did not allow African Americans to fight. The difference here, if you look, the North, they had 2.1 million soldiers fight for them during the war. And the fact that they let African Americans fight really helped them. There weren't really restrictions in the North on who could fight. In the beginning, the Union did not allow African American soldiers to fight. We'll talk about that, but eventually they did. And having that advantage of more people obviously helped the North there. So this is kind of the split of the forces in the war. So you have about 3 million people fight in the war. Experts say around 625,000 people died during the Civil War. That number is actually going up as well. People think it's probably upwards of 800,000, maybe more, 700, 800,000, maybe more people that died. The record keeping during that time period isn't like it is today now. So we know of around 625,000 people, but it's probably more than that actually died in the Civil War. So resources in the North and the South, we know that the North outnumbered the South in people and resources, more factories, more railroads. The South really lacks the manpower and machine power to have any chance at winning the war. They legitimately thought that their fighting spirit would be all that they needed. I say all, that would be the biggest thing that they needed to win the Civil War. And then here is a graph here to show you those resources. The North is the green color, the South is the blue color. The North had a larger population, more railroads, number of farms. This one, a lot of people always look at this one and they go, well, I thought the South would have had more farms because they're more agricultural. That's true. They definitely are more agricultural, but the South had a lot of big farms. And so the North had a ton of small farms. So small farms take up less land, big farms take up more land. And so the North technically had more farms than the South did. And then manufactured goods, that's not really a surprise there because of the factory and machine power in the North. And then the exports there. What really helped the South in exports, remember, was cotton. They were the world leader in cotton production. With the exports, the hope of the South would be that they would be able to get money from their exports. So Naomi had a question that said that soldiers from both sides would hang out together and start fighting. Yeah, if you think about it, well, we'll talk about the soldiers in the war in just a second, but yes, Naomi, that definitely happened because of the nature of this war. So we'll talk about the soldiers in just a second. All right, so the goals of war, obviously for the North, they wanted to restore the Union. They wanted to bring those states back into the Union, bring them back into the country. Lincoln just kind of viewed them, those states, as having like a temper tantrum, like a temporary brain fart where it's like, you don't want to be a part of this country anymore, but you are. So we need to restore the Union to what it was before. They wanted to invade the South and force them to give up this quest for independence, bring them back. The South, their goal was independence. They wanted to become their own country. They didn't want a Congress telling them what to do, telling them how to feel, telling them if they could have slavery or not. They just wanted to be able to make their own decisions for themselves and really feel like they had a government that was looking after them. And they believed that if they fought long enough, that the Union would give up, that the Union would just say, this is a waste of money and other resources and lives, so we'll just, we'll give them up. We'll make them give up. Strategies for both sides. So the North, they had a name for their plan. The North's plan was called the Anaconda Plan. Now, the anaconda is a snake. It's a constrictor. And so what an anaconda does, we know, is it kind of circles its prey and it squeezes it and it can't move, right? So that was the plan of the North. Surround the South, constrict it from being able to move people, resources, whatever, and then they won't be able to do anything. So the first part, there was a three-part plan. The first part was to block the southern ports, take control of all the ports on the Atlantic coast, on the Gulf Coast, on the Mississippi, block all of the ports. Part one, right? Part two, control the Mississippi River. If you control the entirety of the Mississippi River, then the South can't use it, then they can't move people and resources as quickly as they would like to. And that would be completing the second part. Third part was capture Richmond in Virginia, which was the Confederate capital. The idea was you capture the capital, the government can't do anything, wreaks havoc, and the South has to give up, right? So that's the North plan. They feel like if they can do those things, then they would be able to win the war. Winfield Scott actually came up with that plan. He's a bit older now at this point, obviously. He fought in the War of 1812, a war hero, those kinds of things. The South, their strategy was conduct a defensive war, hold as much land as possible. If the North is going to invade, we have to defend. 2, show determination for independence, and the North will give up. Really just like fight until the North gives up is their strategy. And then also win support of Britain and France. The South, knowing that they lacked the resources that the North did, knew they had to make up for that somehow. And so the way they wanted to do that was by getting support of Britain and France. Now, the problem here is most countries in the world, especially the countries that we traded with, Britain, France, Spain, etc., at this point, slavery for them, they didn't want anything to do with slavery. International slave trade was gone. A lot of countries had gotten rid of slavery, and so the United States, I think I said this before, we were the caboose of the let's get rid of slavery train. And so the South, they wanted to get support to Britain and France, and they felt like if they could like win enough in the war, that Great Britain and France would be like, oh, we really need cotton from them, that they'd be desperate enough to help them and then help them win the war. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. All right, so those are the strategies of each side. So let's talk about the soldiers. So Naomi's question said, that the text said that soldiers from both sides would hang out together and then start fighting again. Did this happen often? It definitely did because of the nature of the war. Most families had someone fight in the Civil War because the topic, because the war was so polarizing. You had fathers against sons, you had brothers against brothers, different things like that. And so a lot of times you would be fighting against your brother on the battlefield, the battle would end, and it was like it wasn't happening. It's like the war wasn't going on kind of thing. It's a really strange dynamic of the time period, just because of the nature. I mean, it's civil war, right? It is a dispute within our country. Most soldiers, they worked on farms before they went to war. So most people were farmers, and that's where I'm talking about soldiers from both sides there. They enlisted to fight for their cause, whatever their cause was. Was it, let me help abolish slavery? Was it, let me restore the Union? Was it, let me keep slavery? All those types of things. And just because you lived in the South, it didn't mean you agreed with slavery. It didn't mean that you were a supporter of it. And in the same sense, just because you lived in the North didn't mean you were an abolitionist. Now, most of the time, that's probably the way it was, but not necessarily. The average age of a Civil War soldier was your mid-20s. You had actually a lot of people lie about their age so that they could go fight in the war, and you even had some 14 years old or even younger. So if you see the picture at the top right over here, this was a picture of a boy that joined the war. A lot of times they might have the job of keeping cadence, and so they would be literally the drummer boy that would carry, or someone who would carry the flag kind of deal, but keeping cadence with that drum to make sure that everybody is marching at the same pace. The Civil War in itself was very progressive. It was new technology helped a lot. I say helped. The technology was a lot different at this point. Guns are a lot more accurate. You have rifling in the barrel of the gun, so where you shoot your bullet, if you have good aim, that's where your bullet is going. The mini ball, which was a bullet of a new bullet of the time period, it would when it would hit you or like penetrate the skin, it would break up into a bunch of different pieces. And so because of that, you have a lot of amputations and things like that in the Civil War as well. It is very progressive. It was a war of new technology, but at the same time, they would still stand in straight lines and shoot at each other. So it was still very like old school, but new school at the same time. Early in the war, like I said before, the Union refused to let free African Americans enlist. A lot of leaders feared that white soldiers would not accept them and would mistreat them, which would happen. Eventually, the Union would let African Americans fight, but in their own regiments, and they couldn't be officers. So they were led by white officers, which rubbed some people the wrong way, a lot of people the wrong way. But eventually the Union would let African Americans fight. And then for obvious reasons, the Confederates did not want African Americans to fight at all. They weren't going to give their slaves weapons to use against them. Okay, so expectations of the war. The Union looked at the Confederacy and they're like, they're not going to be able to last very long. They don't have the amount of resources that we do. They weren't taking into consideration the leaders at that point. Early in the war, early on, Robert E. Lee, a general for the Confederacy, he did not join the Confederacy until after Virginia seceded because he wanted to fight with Virginia, his home state. The Confederacy truly believed that their fighting spirit, their determination, would not be subdued by the Union, and that they would be able to win the war. If you hear my dog, I'm sorry, he wants to play now that I'm here to teach. So when the war starts and the first battle happens, and each side kind of looks at the outcome and they are like, okay, this is going to last a lot longer, than we think it's going to last. So neither side really expected the war to last for 4 years, but it does. And our country has a big old mess to clean up after that. All right, the horrors of war. This was, like I said, it was very much a kind of new technology type of war. You have, probably more than 620,000 deaths in the Civil War, more so than any other war we've ever fought in. Obviously, it was just Americans that were fighting in this war, so it was Americans that were dying in the war. A lot of men deserted the war. They left because they were hungry. They left because they were sick. They left just basically out of fear because they didn't want to die in battle. So we're looking at this time period. This was, 50-ish years, almost 50 years after the War of 1812. And that was really the last major war. I mean, you had some mixed in here and there, Spanish-American War, things like that, but this was a huge war, and there were a lot of people who did not have war experience, that just didn't have they didn't have the experience, and the things that they were seeing, it scarred them. It was it's like for a lot of us, we see movies or video games and things like that, and real war is not movies or video games. Another really cool thing about the Civil War is we have tons of journals. Remember, a lot of people can read and write at this point, so a lot of people kept journals. We also have pictures. So these pictures that you're looking at right now, these are pictures from the battle, from the aftermath of some of the battles. Your deserters, they left for those reasons. 1 of every 11 Union soldier left, and then 1 out of every 8 Confederate soldier left. Now, the Confederacy, they already had less people, and then they had more people deserting. And so they just really weren't in a good situation there. Your casualties are anyone that is killed, wounded, or missing in battle. You have hundreds of thousands that die. Your medical facilities, if there were medical facilities, they were overrun. There were way too many people. Many churches and colleges were turned into hospitals. The fighting was happening like near where people lived, near towns and things like that. And so they would have to take the resources they had in that town and turn it into whatever they could. If you went to DC with us and we went to Gettysburg College that was there, a lot of those buildings were turned into, soldiers' quarters and hospital facilities for them. Okay, sorry. All right, so we're going to look at some key battles. We'll probably only look at a few, and then we'll pick up with this tomorrow when you come back to this for part 2. So we're going to look at some key battles. The very first battle happened July after Fort Sumter, July 21st, 1861. Right, we are 3 months after Fort Sumter. Each side just kind of had time to go and look and get together, get their resources together and their people together. The Union in this battle has between 30,000 and 35,000 troops. Their leader at this battle is General George McDowell. He's fired after this battle, and we'll talk about why in a second. The Confederacy, their leader is General P.G.T. Beauregard, or just call him General Beauregard. The Confederacy has between 25,000 and 30,000 men. They meet at Bull Run. This would have been the northern name for the battle. The North named their battles after rivers and streams, nearby rivers and streams. So there was a stream called Bull Run, and so this is what the North called it. The South, they named their battles after nearby towns. So whenever you're reading or you hear something on TV or whatever, the first battle of Bull Run and the first battle of Manassas, those are the same battle. First battle of Manassas would have been the South name for it because it was near the town of Manassas. There are 2 battles of Bull Run or 2 battles of Manassas. So this is the first one. The Confederates, their leader is General Beauregard. They also have Confederate leader General Thomas Jackson. During this battle, the Union having more troops, they are actually able to kind of close in on the Confederates. And what the Confederates do with the help of leadership of Beauregard and Jackson, they rethink their strategy. And so what Thomas Jackson does is he moves his people where he is able to kind of position himself and hold his position with his men. And because he is able to hold this position against the Union, he earns the nickname Stonewall Jackson because he held the position like a stone wall. The Union has to retreat after, Jackson and his troops are like, nope, we're not going anywhere. So they have to retreat. So it's kind of like the first sign of things going bad. The Union troops retreat under the leadership of McDowell. And that's kind of why he's fired, for not, pursuing and he didn't keep going, and Lincoln was like, nope, I don't have time for that, so he fired him. Casualties in this battle. The Union has about 2,900, 2,950, the Confederacy 1,750, and the Confederacy, the South, they are the winners of this first battle. Now, some things we learn from this first battle. One, the Union was not prepared. The leadership there, not good. So Lincoln, he fires McDowell and he hires George McClellan, and that's George McClellan right there. Lincoln says, all right, I need more soldiers because I don't think that, this war is going to last a lot longer than I think it is. Both sides kind of, get that first, it's kind of like your first game of the season if you've ever been on a team, or say like a first performance or whatever. You kind of got to get the nerves out, and so that's kind of what happens at this one, except the Union, they're the losers. And so Lincoln's like, we don't lose, I'm not a loser, we got to make some changes. So Lincoln fires McDowell, hires George McClellan. Keep that name in mind because we're going to talk more about him tomorrow. Lincoln calls for more soldiers. He signs a bill calling for 1 million more soldiers. If you enlist, you're signing up for 3 years, and a lot of people would enlist, including Lincoln's son, his oldest son, Robert Lincoln was his name. He wanted to fight on the front line. Lincoln's son did. Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's wife, was like, nope, you're not allowed to fight on the front line. So he enlists anyway. But Abraham Lincoln, being, you know, commander in chief and president of everything, he makes sure that his son has like a one of the less dangerous jobs. And so he's like a courier, like a messenger for one of the generals. So he's not technically on the front lines. He's with the generals that mainly are behind, right, and things like that. And then what Lincoln does as well is he puts Ulysses S. Grant in charge of the Union troops in the West. So McClellan is in charge in the East. Grant is in charge in the West, and Grant begins his in his theater, in the Western theater of the war, he begins to capture different forts on the Tennessee River for the Union, and he begins setting up a blockade of the Mississippi River. Grant is able to quickly and effectively and efficiently start completing part of the Anaconda Plan of blocking the Mississippi River. So those are changes that are made after one battle. One battle, Lincoln's like, I gotta get it together, right? And he thinks he's found the right combination of things. He's getting more people. He has a more like gung-ho general, you know, more aggressive, and George McClellan, and he knows that Grant's gonna take care of the West. The next battle happened, well, the next major battle we'll talk about happened on March 8th of 1862, so kind of fast forwarding to the next year. You have a battle between ironclads. What ironclads were old ships that were basically turned into armored ships. The Union and the Confederacy both had ironclads. You know, these boats that they outfitted with armor on the outside, they were basically your new technology of battleships. So the Union boat was called the Monitor, and the Confederate boat was called the Virginia. The Virginia wanted the Confederate boat, they traveled, that was my dog, sorry, traveled up the Potomac River towards Washington, D.C. They wanted to see, you know, how close they could get to D.C., you know, how easy it would be. So the Union boat, the Monitor, they wanted to use their ironclad to block southern ports and take all of those. And so they weren't quite ready at this point to go do that with the Monitor, but they were able to use the Monitor to defend DC against the Virginia. So this battle happened on March 8th, 1862, and the battle actually ends in a tie. I think the Union actually like claims victory because they were able to keep the Virginia from coming into DC. But the battle actually ends in a tie. Neither of the boats are destroyed, but it does raise the spirits of both sides because they realize like they actually do have this powerful tool, this powerful weapon in their ironclad. All right, we'll do these last two slides and then we'll be done for today, and then we'll finish up tomorrow. That Zoom code is in your email as well. April 6th, a month later after the Battle of the Ironclads, you have the Battle of Shiloh. And the Battle of Shiloh is one of the battles that has a lot of casualties between the two sides. So Ulysses S. Grant, this is him here, this picture, he has about 40,000 troops with him that he is surprise attacked by the Confederates. So Grant has slowly moved his way south to take control of different parts of the Ohio River and the Tennessee River and now the Mississippi River. They knew that it would be hard for Grant to get reinforcements quickly if they surprise attacked him. And so that's what they decided to do. So the Confederates, they chose, I'm not sure who their general was. I can't remember if it's said in the reading or not. But the Confederacy, they chose to attack before more Union soldiers could help. The Union is able to win. Grant was a no-nonsense kind of person. he was a Plan A only kind of person, kind of like we talked about John Brown in the lecture last week. Ulysses S. Grant, he was Plan A, we're doing this is how we're doing it. He would, though, adjust if he needed to, just a little bit, you know, if it meant winning or losing. And so he was able to win the Battle of Shiloh, but with at the cost of a lot of casualties, not only for the Union, but for the Confederacy as well. Casualties between both sides on a single day of fighting, 23,000. Remember, casualties are injured, killed, missing, or captured, because sometimes each side would take prisoners, obviously, to get more information. After the Battle of Shiloh, you have people who did not get treatment for like 24 hours, you know, for at least 24 hours after the battle, just because of the number of people that were injured. You know, the people who needed the most medical attention got that first. If you didn't have as severe of injuries, you wouldn't get treatment as quickly, or if at all, if there were any resources to do that. All right, the last part today, we're going to look at the capture of New Orleans that happened in April of 1862 as well. After the win at Shiloh, you have Union soldiers led by David Farragut, this is him here, that go and capture the city of New Orleans. This is the largest city in the South at this point. Farragut himself, he actually grew up in the South, but he stayed loyal to the Union. So he was already in the military. And just like I said before, if you were from the South, it didn't necessarily mean that you were in favor of secession or in favor of slavery. So because Farragut is able to capture New Orleans, this meant that the Confederacy now could no longer use the Mississippi River. The last city that the Union needed to capture, the last Confederate city that the Union needed to capture, was Vicksburg in Mississippi, which they would do in 1863, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But by the middle of 1862, the Union had already completed one part of the Anaconda Plan. Remember, there are three parts. 1, block the port. 2, control the Mississippi River. 3, capture Richmond. And so the Union at this point had already done that, which really helped them kind of move forward. Now, in the West, things are going really, 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 really well. But in the East, not so much. And so tomorrow, that's where we're going to pick up with. We're going to pick up with talking about the troubles that the Union was having in the East with their leadership and everything there. Again, I hope you guys are doing well with your packets. I did post the discussion questions for this week, next week, and week 8. There are no discussion questions for week 9, so you don't have to worry about doing those. The quizzes codes are at the end of your packet, so you can do those. If you have any questions as you're going through anything, remember to let me know. And then tomorrow, we are going to finish up our lesson on the Civil War. I didn't do a note taker this time, since you do have the packets. I didn't figure you would need that, but this slideshow I did email you. It wouldn't fit on my website, it's too big. I had to take everything and put it into one. So if you don't have any questions for me, I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting, and I'll see you guys tomorrow at 10 a.m. If you do have questions, you can text me through Remind, you can email me those as well. All right, I miss you guys, I love you, bye.